Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Peak week myths. Welcome to J3U podcast Mythbuster edition. We're on peak week. Well, I guess Luke, we're both on peak week, aren't we? He has so many coaching clients there. It's always a peak week for Luke.
It's always peak week.
Myself, am actually in peak week for Vancouver Pro. And that is the potentially, well, we won't say anything else about that. But potentially this is for me. But anyway, being that it is peak week, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are in peak week as well and thinking about all these magical things that they're going to be doing on peak week. And all of a sudden, this unprepared physique that's looking a little soft is going to just turn to rock hard granite, be chiseled of stone, and you'll walk on stage and look phenomenal. Well, we're going to go over a few myths today on items that have been in circulation that are touted to be must-dos or must-not-dos, and break them down and see if they actually need to be done. So, number one.
Do you cut that
growth GH
hormone
out. Cut out your growth hormone.
It's a classic, like old school bodybuilding, like this is just what everybody does. And so you need to do it too. And I think we can take a little bit of a better look into some of the whys, because there's clients that I definitely, cut it out with. And there's clients that I won't. And there's such a drastic visual change that happens. There needs to be a better logic as to like why you could and why you couldn't. Because like for some of the clients I leave it in, like I had one last year who forgot to take it a couple of days and then left it at the house leading into the show. And it was like 6 days of no growth. And it was just such a flat physique and so hard to chase and like try to get back the fullness that growth brought. It's like, let's dive in. Like, why would you cut it? Why would you not? And are you going to be doing it?
Well, with growth hormone, it does increase, it can increase water retention. And for most that it will, and it's usually like a dose dependent fashion. So the higher growth hormone goes, the higher you'll probably drive up aldosterone and cause some degree of water retention. But I think we say water retention immediately jumps to the fact that people refer to subcutaneous water that's not inside the muscle, to where it's going to skew some of this visual look. And, within this, it's, if you're very lean, a lot of this water retention could be intramuscular as well. And we can't really differentiate between water inside the muscle and water outside the muscle. Intracellular and extracellular ratios of water hold pretty tightly. And I think these terms get thrown around. I don't want to dive deep into it because it can get very confusing. But what I want to say is intracellular and extracellular does not mean inside the muscle and outside the muscle. So a lot of people are saying, oh, well, you'll cut extracellular water and just drive it intracellular, thinking they're just driving water in the muscle and not and limiting it outside the muscle. Body doesn't work like that. So if you're decreasing water as a whole, usually we're limiting water inside and outside fat cells, which is what you could be seeing, but also inside and outside cells that are in the muscle. So a lot of times with growth hormone, when you reduce growth hormone and you do reduce total body water, you're also going to reduce fullness that's in the muscle, but also you could decrease water that's outside the muscle and make you look a little sharper. So we're kind of looking at this trade-off with growth hormone, right? How much does it make someone lose a little bit of condition, but you gain a bunch of fullness? Now, sometimes that fullness might actually make you look harder, even though you have more water outside the muscle, because that muscle is pushing against the skin harder. So this is an assessment that needs to take place. And just to assume that, well, you have to cut it completely out because we want to limit all water that's outside the muscle, realize that you're definitely sacrificing some degree of fullness that might not be a better look. So being more dehydrated, we could say, or I hate saying drier, but that someone is going to understand that, doesn't always mean better. And so growth hormone, it's going to be needs-based, just like any PED. So as we're leading up to show, what I'm looking at usually 3 to 5 weeks out, trying to gauge the degree of, is it water or is it fat? I start playing with testosterone, testing this out a bit. Also, I can kind of make a pull on growth hormone at this stage, see what the impact is for the physique. Like, do they get really hard, a lot harder? Was that water retention, or do I see a big drop in fullness? Now, I'll give you my own mistakes made that, coaching myself, you can get in your head a bit. You try to pull a lot of levers and bring a harder look, and it can take a turn for the worse, and you're like, can freak out of what's happening. So Luke had to look at my pictures and be like, Luke, what am I doing to give me some guidance? Because this was like 3.5 weeks ago, is I had reduced growth hormone down to like 5 IUs into Toronto, which was fine. Past data for Legion, I was using like 7 IUs, and I kept reducing it down over these weeks into the show. And I was getting to lighter body weights than what I was for Toronto, but I wasn't as lean. I was like, what is happening? Like, oh my gosh, like I'm smaller and just fat. And so looking back with like a second eye is like, okay, past data, you having growth hormone in gives a fullness level that doesn't sacrifice condition. And now bringing this back up to a higher level, body weight came up, and I actually kept improving and getting leaner because it makes that big of impact for me personally. Now, not to waft on about myself, but there's other clients that when you have that guy that is the round bubbly guy, that's usually the one that doesn't get super conditioned, that stays a little soft. That's usually the guy where you can make a greater sacrifice in growth hormone because they stay so round anyway, and they probably have the tissue to spare, but they need to gain that much more ground and condition. So this works on a spectrum. It's not just like there's the condition guy and there's the round bubbly guy. There's all the way across the board, and there's going to be some guy that's both round bubbly and rock hard, and maybe he just has growth hormone the whole time and he looks even better than all of us. Probably that guy out there. So what is the myth is should you always cut GH out? No, you should evaluate the client and see where they fall in that spectrum, then make your decisions from there.
Yeah, it's such a huge change, and it's so funny because like it was such a big learning curve like last year for you. Like we were how high the growth hormone heading into the back end of competing last year, like how high it was and how good the visuals were. It was like such eye-opening of there's variance in different portions of the year depending on how lean you are versus how long you've been dieting, that this can be a tool that fluctuates in and out based on a visual. So I'm excited to see how it pans out for Vancouver, just because like it was such a sharp, like, John, just put it back in. Like it's going to just help. But I really like the next one as far as like the leg 7 days out one. I understand the logic of wanting to drop leg fatigue. I think with the way that we run preps and looking at pre-planning the timeline out to where you're ready ahead and dropping fatigue headed into the show, this steadfast rule doesn't apply to everyone. And it's going to probably apply more on the male side than the female side. And this is where this myth being cross-applied to every athlete, it just is such a poor decision, especially when you start crossing into the female categories.
Yeah, I think with, just like we brought up with growth hormone, there can be just an evaluation that takes place, right? So what I'm usually looking at through check-ins, and as we're getting close to a show for an athlete, we're doing daily check-ins, right? And I'm looking at their daily logs, and I'll see someone that trains legs, and I might see body weight tick up the next day or 2 days later. I also might see their visuals get skewed just from their quads start to look softer, and then they harden back up in X amount of days. And so through this, I'm already starting to realize and map out how many days does it take post-leg training to where they gain back that condition and that look. And another thing to evaluate here is like, are they going to keep training legs at that capacity up to the show? So maybe you train legs and like the way it falls in your splits, like, oh, I'm going to be 5 days out for my show. Like I need to change my split to make sure it's set 7 days out, because that's the magic number. Well, what you can do too is just modify your training, right? If you're trained 5 days out and you know that this level of volume in these exercise choices really inflame your legs, it's like, well, you could reduce the volume, or you could do some exercise changes. You could reduce your effort, because what we know is volume in training close proximity to failure, and also movements that really have a big eccentric component and load lengthened are going to cause a lot of damage. So we can modify around those items, those variables, to make a leg day that doesn't inflame you. And you make consideration of, right, Luke, for your wellness client. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. But just for this idea around how you should modify training is, first, looking at how long it takes for someone to get back to their baseline, and then what program changes you might make initially, just to let them lead into the show off of that. And then I think that gets into our other cases where you have athletes, right, that's also all they do is train legs.
Yeah. I mean, wellness in bikini, right? Like their baseline of frequency and volume is sky high, and they've adapted to that level of stimulus, right? Where more so peak week is not full removal of leg training. It's just doing some of the adjustments that John previously mentioned, like pulling off some of the major compounds later in the week, pulling down the total volume throughout the week for the leg sessions, kind of tapering in isolations through the back end versus on the front end. You can maybe have 1 or 2 compounds, but split design's not overly changing, and you're just bringing in more reps in reserve and lowering volume throughout the week as you get closer to the show. Where leg training for a lot of these wellness girls, like 2 days out, I'll have been doing like a little bit of glute pump work, just because it's a day that they typically have a little bit of glute work on, right? And so it's definitely something that I've actually seen detriment a class like that, bikini or wellness, if you like start fully removing, because they've adapted to so much stimulus that it starts to kind of actually see a regression in those visuals. So it's a huge portion of understanding the contextual baseline of stimulus this person operates at. How far does it actually deter the look? And then how much do you have to pull back to shorten that frame of a negative impact on the visuals you're going to bring on stage?
Yeah. I mean, otherwise your wellness athlete just wouldn't train for the whole week, right?
At all.
Or I guess we'll do upper body now, since we don't know what else to train. But I think another thing to consider also is the level of fatigue that the athletes is carrying for how much you might need to adjust that last training piece. My buddy came up to me it was actually my last leg day before Toronto. He's like, hey man, I see you're still doing like axial loaded movements. Like, shouldn't you have modified those? I was like, well, I already know how I handle this session fatigue wise. And I've also been, ready, food's up, I'm not pushing fat loss anymore. So I'm not carrying a lot of fatigue to need to drop off a lot. And I know that this session isn't overly taxing. So I didn't need to move to say, like, I did a Rogers squat for my last session, which a squat pattern, people are like, you should just do a leg press. But for me, I already know what that does. But for someone else, if they have some type of squat pattern and it's taxing, maybe it would be, hey, you're just doing a leg press, leg extension, and leg curl for this last leg day. And there's a good rationale there for the person that has been having to dig down and is pretty fatigued going into that peak week. So again, it's like a spectrum you need to work on here. And another consideration point that I would make too is that I also want them to be able to pose and practice leading into peak week. I do taper posing down across peak week, but also I'm not looking for them to be like training legs 5 days out. 1 day out, they finally feel fresh, and then they're on stage the next day. Like, I would like a few days of feeling fresh and being able to go through their poses and see how that looks, and make consideration for that too.
Yeah, because the high fatigue athlete, like, you could be removing it 8, 9, 10 days out, depending on how high that fatigue level is. So it's so contextual. But
my last day was 9 days out, actually, for Toronto. Yeah. And this show, I'm not changing either. The show's on Sunday and I train legs on Friday. I'm like, I don't want to move my split around. I'm just going to train and then
do your thing.
It's all good. Yeah. Like, have an extra 2 days off. Like, my legs aren't going anywhere. Like, I'm not going to, man, I got to train legs. I'm going to like lose my legs. It's like, no, they're
fine.
They'll hang on for 9 days. So But I think we'll jump to myth number 3.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Cutting water is a must. And we just did
Cutting water's must.
an excellent podcast on this, of like all the potential cases that you could see. Because man, again, like hydrated is striated is one of the truest statements I've ever heard in this industry. And in an industry that a lot of myths get blanketly applied, like it's something that fluid intake is largely dictated based on which direction you need to push a physique and how much it negatively or positively impacts that look. And there are so many loads that I've seen from other coaches where the removal of water is a must. They cite that they're super flat on stage. Then they go eat and hydrate after the show. And they're like, I feel amazing. And it's like, yeah, you probably would have felt like that if you would have just kept fluid in so that your loading into the show would have worked, right? So
no, Luke, they said I needed to eat a cheeseburger instead. That's what I ate post show.
which is
Now you have a cheeseburger the night before.
so then the next peak's still bad because you still remove the fluid and you have the cheeseburger, and then you have distended stomach on stage because your GI's wrecked. But it's so funny because it's such a simple thing that if you look, and this always happens to the athlete that looks phenomenal leading into the show, and they think a change from that baseline is going to drastically improve it. And that's the funniest thing to me, John.
Yeah, I've been there. I understand, like, oh, you want to be so dry, like the desert on stage, right? But if you're waking up and you're flat, and then it makes sense to me. Like then you someone drinks fluids, they eat food, they go train. Their post workout visuals are like mind blowing, right? Like those are the grainy, hard photos you see. It's like, man, you could walk on stage like this. They're like, yeah, totally. Okay, well, let's cut all the water out though. But you had water before you went and trained, right? You looked amazing. It's like, right. And you wake up in the morning really dehydrated and flat, right? Okay, so cut water more. It's like, no, wrong still. So if someone's waking up and their body weight's low and they look smooth and they're flat, they need water because they're going to be eating food too. If you're having food in, there's some degree of water that's going to need to be associated with that food intake. And that's just going to vary a lot. And it works on a spectrum. So we have like different levels of athletes, and based on the condition requirements for that as well, of how far off from fasted is their best visual. So some people are really close and they might just have some fluids with meals, and that might be enough for them. That kind of gets into our like small muscularity classes, or those that are very responsive to smaller amounts of food increases and fluid increases. Or we might have someone else that needs a lot of food and fluid requirement. And as food goes up, fluid probably needs to go up. I would say to some degree though, usually there's a level of water decrease on show day, but a decrease. It would be rare that you'd ever need to fully cut out water. I don't even know of a case I've had where I had to fully cut out water. Maybe it stopped a few hours before stage time, just so you don't feel like you need to go out there and pee. But there's some degree of water that should be happening on show day. The big cuts the day prior, one day out, that should be assessment based, just like Luke and I keep bringing up. And that's why we teach so much in J3U, is the assessment part of this. Is like every day a peak week, we're trying to learn what we need to do for show day. So we're seeing how much water someone pushes out overnight. And if someone's going to be waking up and they're going to be low in body weight, then it doesn't make sense to have further water reduction the day before the show. So it's just an assessment needs to take place every day. A peak week is trying to build out your data so you can make those right calls one day to show day.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, just to add one little piece, it's all relative to a client baseline. Like, I have 5 athletes competing this week at Universe, and I have one athlete whose baseline fluid intake is almost 300 ounces of fluid. I also have another athlete whose baseline fluid intake is 150. That baseline fluid intake and rate of fluid consumption drastically changes how much fluid I'm going to put them on stage at. And so I need those 2 athletes waking up at different gaps from their ideal look to be able to warrant the hydration status that brings about their best visual. And so that's how you start to kind of get into different analysis of that. But I think that brings us to the last point, right? Like the classic
Myth number 4.
vodka shot before we get on stage.
But Ronnie did it.
I don't even remember what the alcohol was that Ronnie did it with. I think tequila.
I don't remember. It might have been vodka. I think it was like going in Kevin Leverone's room, right? He's like, "What are you doing, man?" He's like, "Just drink these shots." And
yeah, because
so
everything Ronnie Coleman did, we should treat as gospel. But continue.
Yeah, it does go back to the water piece, the fact that do you need to have more diuresis happen overnight than what's already happening? And so Luke and I are tracking these body weight changes across peak week. What's your PM weight? What's your AM weight? So in a lot of times what we see across a peak week is someone will start diuresing more overnight. And so you might have someone that drops 5 pounds overnight, then we're seeing maybe 6 pounds. As carbs go in, that might slow down, but it just varies. And so a lot of times someone is improving their diuresis overnight and they might be waking up like even flatter. And so we may make considerations for that of how do we hold them more overnight, not how do I get them to drop more water overnight. So all these tactics like, hey, drink alcohol the day before the show so you can drop a bunch more water. It's like, well, the question should come first. Do you need to drop more water? Maybe you need to hold on to some of that water overnight to not drop as much if you're waking up extremely flat. I for this new prep module that's coming out, I did have to answer this question because I hadn't had it in J3U before. I'm like, well, I should probably bring it up because I've seen people drink absolutely. One time I was one day out at a local show and this guy's, hey man, what do you think? How much red wine should I be drinking? He had a bottle with him. He's like, I'm halfway through the bottle. He was buzzed, man. He was buzzed. I'm like, he's like, I think I'm going to finish it. I'm like, I don't know if you should. I think you should ask your coach. But I was like, yeah, this guy's gonna be hungover the next day. But anyway, like in a hydrated state, it does increase a little bit of diuresis. But once you're dehydrated, alcohol actually doesn't make you increase diuresis anymore in that hypohydrated state. So, it doesn't really add anything. I think it could have detriment too if you're introducing a variable amongst all the other variables that you have to try to sort out. So first things first, like, do you need to lose more water or not? And are you already losing enough? Some people might just want the shot because it might help them sleep at night. I've seen some girls do some shots before stage just to relax them. I don't think it's the idea of, all of a sudden the red wine drink is going to make you super vascular on stage. I don't think we're awarded for vascularity in our female classes or male classes. So I think it's more of the just trying to chill out a little bit before you go on stage. Mm-hmm. But what I would just end with around this alcohol or whatever it is, M&Ms and Starburst before you go on stage, I don't know. There is no magic cocktail or concoction that's going to take a non-stage ready physique to stage ready in just these last moments before you get on. So during peak week, you should have been able to see that show day look at some point where you could walk on at that moment and look right. If you're not finding that during your peak week sometime, it's likely something needed to happen and maybe more time was needed dieting. But these last like Hail Mary attempts of like, let me take some shots or let me go eat the chocolate bar, like peanut butter and, whatever it may be, that's going to fill me out and make me pop. All these final attempts, like usually it's nothing that we're doing that's landing a physique that wasn't already fat-free on stage looking right.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just, it's just so simple. Just do the first portion of the process, right? And it makes this portion of the process super easy. But I think that kind of wraps it up for myths. Yeah. Peak week myths. Cause all the things, John's not doing heading into Vancouver.
I had to make this list to make sure I didn't do them. Just so by myself.
Is that why you're bringing me? Is that why you're dragging me to Vancouver?
Yeah, it's like, John, don't switch your water to only wine. Don't, train legs normal. Don't cut your growth hormone out. All of a sudden I'll be like down to 212, doing the 212 class in Vancouver. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed Peak Week Myths. If you have other myths you'd like Luke and I to cover or questions, you can leave them down in the comment section below if you're on YouTube, and maybe we'll hit those in another episode. But I'm going to head over to Vancouver. We're going to take out this show, and hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll talk to you next time.